So in today's video, I'm going to go over how to install the Autometer triple gauge pillar pod. So when it comes to the Foxbody Mustang, you don't really have a lot of options. The dash isn't very big, and unless you completely modify behind your radio, you don't really have too many options to do this. With the boosted application, I need my wide bands. I obviously want to be looking at my fuel and my boost. So this is pretty common combinations. I'm going to show you how I install these. This comes in a couple different varieties. You can come in single, double, or triple. Obviously, it's a triple. The wiring, I'm going to show you my wiring. Now, this is going to depend on the gauges that you're using. So first thing to note with your gauges, most of your gauges are going to come with a little plastic or metal clamp on the back that allows it to clamp onto whatever you're pushing these into. That's not actually how these install. On this one, they're actually a friction fit. So when you put these in, you don't need to use these mounting screws. So in this case, you just push those in, and they're not going anywhere. They're quite tight. So the next option you're going to have to choose is whether or not you're going to hook any of your gauges to the lighting circuit, or if you just want it on whenever the ignition is hot. So in my case, I only want these on when the lights are on. Now my boost gauge is a mechanical gauge, so you can see I have a vacuum line with appropriate hardware. I've just used a little bit of plumber's tape just to make sure I get a nice solid connection. So with a mechanical gauge like this, you want to make sure there's a shipping pin, and when it ships, it actually is going to come to you. You'll see the gauge will actually be reading off 0. That's by design. So when you are ready to actually install the gauge, you want to go ahead and make sure you pull this pin. Just make sure none of this is pinched off. And you can see I've actually soldered and heat shrink these, and then I've taken some zip ties just to make these nice and neat so it'll sit in. So this pillar pod does not actually replace the pillar plastic that is actually in the car. This actually becomes an overlay. So I haven't taken that out yet, but I just want, before you start taking that out, you just want to realize, make sure you don't throw that away, or if you need it, make sure you have it. So in the case of my fuel pressure gauge, this is an electric gauge. So I have a red and a black wire. This will be my hot. And the other two wires are actually connected all the way to the sender. So this is going to go actually all the way to my fuel system. I'm not going to install that part today, but I'm just going to get the pod and everything else wired. So to gain access to our pillar, we're going to need to remove this speaker cover. There's a screw in the side of here. You want to go ahead, remove him. And then to remove the speaker cover, a little trick here. So here's a quick tip for when you need to remove the trim up around your headliner that comes around here. You see here, you see this clip. So what you do is you pull off the bottom of this trim, and then that's going to expose this clip. Now this clip, when it's up here, is actually going to be installed. He's going to actually be pushed into the body itself. And when you release it, you're going to need to pull this guy out. You can see there's a little hole up in here. And that's really what you, when you get your pry tool in here, what you're really trying to do when you're pulling that, you want to pop this guy out. Now with our trim removed, we need to complete the wiring. And there's two parts to the circuit we have to do. One is to the power, to actually power the gauges, like the fuel sensor. Then the other piece of it is the lighting. So in this case, this is a Foxbody Mustang. So I have to go to the light switch because I'm looking for the circuit that's going to feed the gauge cluster. The power feed that lights the dash that comes on with the lights, we're going to use that same circuit so that when we turn on our headlights, that'll turn on our gauge cluster lights. So in an 89, actually for 87 to 89 Mustang, this position here, this is the connector that goes to the light switch. This first position in this corner, you can see it's a blue with a red stripe. I'm actually going to tap into him, and if you're not confident that that's actually the right one, you could actually take your light switch, plug it back in, and use a test light. You can see I've poked a tiny little hole in here. I've already done that. I've confirmed it. But that's the position you're going to want. So now I'm going to tap in the fuse holder that I put in, because obviously there's a fuse to this circuit, but because I'm pulling off a branch in parallel, I need to make sure that the branch that's coming off of here is very important. It has its own fuse, because if that thing lets go, you might have an issue. You don't want to damage your gauges if something lets go. So I'll put a link in the description. I'm using simple little inline fuse. In this case, I'm actually using a 5 amp fuse. I probably could go down to 3 without any issues. These are actually rated at 5 amps. I wouldn't go any bigger than that for what we're doing since we're doing lights. But what we're going to do, obviously I want to have access to this. If for some reason I lose the light bulbs or something like that, and I'm not sure, and I want to check the fuse, I don't want to put him up here and then I can't access it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap in here, stuff the wire down in here in this fuse, so I'll have him down near the kick panel so I can easily access it. I don't want to have to remove my dash just to simply check a fuse. Okay, so to splice into this, when I cut this guy open, there's not a lot of slack in this wire. Okay, so here's the whip that we just soldered. I've added a little bit of loom to it, and I've gone ahead and labeled what my fuse is so I know what it is underneath. And then all I'm going to do, I'm just going to snake it from underneath, bring him up next to this wire here. We're going to tie all these guys together. Now what I had to do, because these wires, there's not a lot of slack in here, all I've done, I've simply soldered on a little extension, so when I bring the wire up from underneath, we'll have plenty of room. We won't be fighting with it. So just to make it clear what I've done, the wire, the blue wire with the red stripe, I've actually spliced into him. And again, I added this little extension. Then I have the wire coming from underneath that goes to my fuse. And what I've done is I've soldered these all together. So outside the car, we have our original A-pillar, and you can see there was 2 screws. These screws are the ones that actually attach the A-pillar plastic to the car. And I think probably the misconception many people have is it looks, you would think that this replaces that. Well, it actually doesn't. It's a cover. So this is going to snap on. So you kind of have to do some prep work here. All these wires are going to go down along the A-pillar down towards the kick panel. So we need to plan for that. So all these wires are going to get snaked down along to the bottom of the kick panel. Then what I need to do is I need to plan the hole for where these wires are going to pass through, because it needs to go through the original plastic. So we're going to drill a hole, and we need to make sure our hole is built big enough to pass any of the things going through it. So I'm just going to use a unibit to drill my hole. Now the other prep work I've done, and it's going to depend on the gauges that you're using, is this goes to my fuel pressure gauge. So I have the power connection that goes to the back of the gauge. And on the far other end, this will be the part that goes all the way out to my fuel system. But what I've done is I've just basically heat shrinked and put loom on here. It just makes it so it doesn't become a big spaghetti mess. Makes it nice and neat. The other thing I've done, so I made sure I have it properly labeled, so when I hook it up to my circuit for my power and ground for this gauge, I know which one I'm dealing with. Okay, everything's run through the hole. I've got my power connection connected to my fuel pressure gauge. So I've put a couple zip ties just to keep everything nice and neat. Made sure, again, this is just a reminder, make sure you remove any of the shipping safety pins on any of your Autometer gauges. And now what we need to do, it's kind of a 2-step process. First, you have to put the other plastic back on. So the Autometer covers come with little push pins. So we're going to drill 4 holes, push these in, and it holds the cover securely in place. So I placed the pillar and the gauge pod on top of my dash. Give me a place to sit. And then what I've done is I've taken one by one. I found it was easier than trying to take one big harness. And I've just taken a snake, come in through here. Pretty simple. I do have loom on everything. You know, when you go through the dash, there are a lot of sharp edges. So I did put loom on everything just to make sure I don't nick anything as it's going through. As far as reinstallation goes, it's very straightforward. Pretty much the opposite of the way we took things out. I screwed the stock or the OEM pillar in, snap this guy on, and then what I recommend you do, go ahead and snap in your roof trim, because once you've snapped this guy in, it almost holds it without putting this in. Now, one little mistake I made so you can avoid this. You want this guy to be a little bit more inboard, maybe a good inch in from the edge probably. What happens here when you have it here, it goes through the plastic fine, but then it runs up against the rubber trim of your door. So I'll straighten this out later. I basically cut it off flush. I'll come back and clean this up, and I'll put another push pin in there so it looks nice. So now we have 4 connections left. Okay, so here's our 4 connections. So as you recall, I came down from the switch through a fuse. Then I had my power wire coming from the lighting circuit up in the gauge pod, which comes down here. I've soldered him together. And we have 2 grounds. So this ground is for my lighting. Now these will both go to a common point. I've just used a butt connector to the end. And then, as you recall, I have a fuel pressure gauge. So for those who have not seen my video on adding an auxiliary fuse block, this is where I start reaping the benefits of that previous labor. So to power my gauge, I've got multiple things that I'm adding. So now I don't even have to worry about tapping into the fuse box or anything like that. So I'm bringing my power directly from that auxiliary fuse box. I'm going to go ahead and shrink wrap this guy, but I've gone ahead and soldered this together. So now I have power to my fuel pressure gauge. Okay, grounds are done. Got wires tucked up. Okay, I've temporarily installed my light switch. And if all goes well, and voila, we have success. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will catch you on the next one.